beyond the forbidden.
But if I can go ahead and pick one, like I would probably go down your route, something like that, and focus on, because I love it. You know what I mean? I guess you could call it, hell, it's got a little bit of everything in it. You know, the paranormal, the occult, supernatural, ancient mysteries. You know, that's my forte. You know, and then it's just, I'm a huge advocate for like older stuff, like this right here. I got a little weird magazine fetish, like old magazines. This is the Searcher from like the 1960s. I literally got a huge box full of magazines. I got and I collect old newspapers. Actually, I got JFK somewhere, but I collect a bunch of older stuff, mostly older magazines and newspapers. But like I said, if I could pick one, definitely go down your route though. But what made you want to like just focus on like newspaper clippings? You know what I mean? And instead of, because you talk a little bit about everything, like I could tell you're very knowledgeable in a lot of things with our last conversation. But what made you kind of focus just particularly on like old newspaper clippings?
Well, many moons ago, like almost 5 years ago now, I was co-hosting a radio show with a Danish friend, and it was called Radio Tartary. And this is like before the Tartaria stuff really kind of exploded, I guess. And the host of the show, his name's Victor. He was like one of the early people on YouTube doing the kind of deep archive stuff when it came to Tartaria, you know, maps, literature, so on and so forth. And I had just randomly came across his work, and we had a lot of similarities as far as kind of our look on history. And this term mud flood had just come onto the scene. And I had been noticing a lot of that in my own explorations of old literature and old photographs. I had just always been drawn to like old pictures, old photographs, old maps. Anyways, long story short, I reached out to him. We became friends. We did the radio show, and through that radio program, I had to really start kind of consolidating my work and putting it into a more focused subject matter, it being Tartaria, the mud flood ideas. You know, are we survivors or remnants of a reset of some kind? And through doing that radio show, I just kind of established this layout that it all kind of came together through these people we met doing the show, and our friends, some of our friends from around the world on Discord. And anyways, long story short, you know, I had been posting books and archive works from books I had been reading for over 10 years. I've been posting stuff like similar to this, but not newspaper totally related, for about over 13 years now. Twitter mostly was my only real social media. But yeah, so then I just, I think I've told this story before, but I had used the digital archive to go back and look for an article that had been written about me when I was in middle school. I found a pipe bomb outside my middle school, and bomb squad came. You know, they closed down the block, detonated the bomb actually on the middle school property. So the local newspaper came and did a story about me, and you know, I was kind of like mediocre famous at my middle school for finding the bomb and blah blah blah. And anyways, fast forward 20 years, maybe not 15 years. It was after high school, and I had told the story to some friends, and they didn't believe me, and so I had to go down to my local library, and they were like in the phase. This is probably 2005, maybe a little earlier. They were in the phase of like it's still half being digital and half being analog, and they were like slowly archiving it. Anyways, long story short, I managed to find the article and blah blah blah. So I had some experience. Like you can like find anything on this, right? It was very archaic at the time. It was not very easy. There was no keyword searches. I had to search by date, right? Because I knew when I found it, blah 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 blah. So I had remembered that, and I had used all these different congressional sources to find old maps, because when you're talking about mud flood in Tartaria, especially, this is again 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago, 6 years ago, congressional archives were just coming online, and that's where I was finding a lot of my maps that had shown Tartaria being this large swath of land. And anyways, then I just found my way through the congressional archive into their newspapers, and that's just kind of where it kicked off. And through some friends and their advice, and just kind of, I had been sharing my newspaper stuff privately for a few years. And, a friend of mine now, Greg at the Higher Side Chats, we had been kind of pen pals for a few years. And then, he had me on his show, and I just kind of at that point had made it my focus. And I just love the ability to kind of take a step back in time. And you can see that the way that they're not only describing whatever they're finding, it just feels like you're almost there with them. It's not like you're reading an archaeological book where someone has told the story several times. They've kind of polished it up, and they've revisited the story, or they revised things, or they've had different people kind of have their way with the story. And that's kind of how it works. Whereas these newspapers, the stories, they're super fresh. And if you take what you find in a newspaper and try to look for a particular explorer, or, someone from the geological department or whatever it is, you'll never find it actually in a printed book. And if you do, it's a very scant version of what you find in these newspapers. And as you're aware, the kind of filtering and scrubbing of these types of stories was far more difficult in this time frame, just due to the fact that, again, we're dealing with an analog system. So these stories take days, months, even longer to reach a audience that may have an issue with the story, or that before they can actually get in there and make the stories disappear, so to say. And in this time frame, the Smithsonian was the biggest perpetrator, so to say, in that kind of cover up or collection, right? Smithsonian himself, he was a collector. That's what he was. More so that than he was about a cover up. And that just kind of went hand in hand with it. But yeah, that was a long-winded answer, but I've just found that the newspapers provide me with the ability to kind of take a step back into time, and it feels much more authentic, right? And of course, the number one negative that people have to say about newspapers is, people were yellow journalism has existed from the beginning of time, and certainly that's a possibility with any kind of journalism, is that you're going to have a person kind of interpreting things with their own opinion and beliefs and so on and so forth. But, as you've seen, and I've been doing this so long now, and I've, that percentage of coincidence to reality, just as time goes on, it just undeniable for me, and people that have been following my work long enough see that there's a lot of patterns. And it's
Become a member on Patreon and support Beyond the Forbidden to watch this full-length interview. With your membership, you will have access to a vast archive of full-length, ad-free interviews, face-to-face interviews, bonus shows, and much more. So what the hell are you waiting for? The link is in the description.
there's just too much to it now at this point.
How many do you have archived so far?
Whole newspaper pages, I have over 10,000. Like individual articles, probably like 3 or 4,000, and actual posts, I don't even know, somewhere in that same amount of number. I have probably 9,000 posts, and I'd say half of them are newspaper related.
Why I ask is because let's say that just as of right now, you've only done 10,000, and there's probably millions out there, you know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So not all 10,000 are going to be some kind of hoax, some kind of scam, somebody's just wild imagination. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean, the giants, right? That's kind of what I think brought me and you together.
Yep.
I mean, I have 1,200 on just giants. So to pretend like that's somebody's misinterpretation of calling someone who's 7 feet a giant, I mean,
or like the one I told you about on our last interview. I found one, and I think it was 17 feet. Okay.
Yeah, I have several.
You know what I mean?
In that range. Yep.
How are you going to misinterpret like 7 feet from 17 feet? You know,
mm-hmm.
or more.
Yeah, and I think kind of an underlying definitive, so to say, statement I make on my channel is that when we're looking at previous ages, we're dealing with successive ages, several different events or time periods, cataclysms, resets. There are many ways to describe them, but the farther you go back in time, the larger everything gets. And they've been able to show, kind of correlating again the fossil record, but the time frames with fossil records and all these things have been really muddled with, and it's been very easy through their own science to manipulate the numbers. But as you go farther back through these kind of layers, and they'll tell you that this particular layer, the Mesozoic, whatever, Cretaceous, these layers can be anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 years or more, right? But I don't believe that for a second. A video I did recently, I talk about one of the first North American explorers in the Yucatan was digging a well for these men that he had hired to excavate these Mayan ruins, right? And this is surface level ruins. They're like, some of them are buried 8 feet, 9 feet, and covered in debris. The leaves, the jungle's overgrown them. So he's hired all these workers. Well, we got to dig a well. Well, he digs a well and he finds 4 separate civilizations. So he digs a well that basically goes through the rubble of the group or civilization, so to say, the cultural layer that they're digging up on the top, on the surface level. And then there's about 8 to 10 feet of earth. And then he hits another city. And he does this 4 times. So it took them a month to dig the well, and he reached 4 different cities, each one of them with different art, different language, different construction methods, different concrete, stonework. And as he gets deeper, it gets more advanced. And as anyone's seen with the Mayan ruins, they're incredibly advanced. So, but yeah, that's kind of the narrative that I've been showing all throughout, again, my Anomalous America stuff, is that we're dealing with several successive ages. And when we talk about these giants and these varying heights, the oxygen levels and all of these things have been proven to be different throughout these kind of cultural layers. And that when you talk about dinosaurs and giant lizards, and you find that their lungs and their breathing apparatus, their mouths and their nose, they're quite small for the size of the creature. So again, density, oxygen levels, all these things come into play. And for the only way for these animals to exist is that the atmosphere and the kind of world they inhabited was quite different than the one we inhabit. And when we talk about giant humans, it's the same thing. We're dealing with these large humans occupying a space with these giant dragons, right? Because dinosaur is a new term. The term dinosaur is not even 200 years old yet. And you go back 300-400 years, it's all dragon related. So the word dragon doesn't just mean, what we've kind of been led to believe in the fantasy sense of flying creatures, although there were plenty of them. But yeah, again, a long-winded answer, but we're looking at several time periods where man has gone through significant changes, size being probably the most abundant as far as my examples go. But I'm finding skeletons of half dog, dog-headed men were found in a mound in Montana. Men with wings have been found in mounds in the southern states. Men with tails have been found. Men with single eyes, cyclops. So we're not dealing with just one or two or three. We're dealing with all these different examples. And same thing goes with dwarfs, gnomes. I kind of always fall back on the idea that Tolkien was, again, even in his own words, Tolkien flat out said that he based a lot of his stories on what he believed to be true of our
You
past.
just read my mind, man, because oh my gosh. And we're about to get into, everybody listening, we're about to get into some of his clippings. But so today my daughter had to get off work a little early. Me and my wife she had a little appointment at the pediatric clinic. And so after that we went to the I think Books a Million, yeah, Books a Million. And I just walked past and I saw Tolkien, and it's like, damn, it was three books, but it had I think it was all 12 of the Middle Earth,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, at the middle. What I don't understand, man, is that when it comes to Tolkien and other, either science fiction or just fiction authors,
Mm-hmm.
it's labeled as fiction, because one, it's being deliberately covered up. People that the powers that shouldn't be, they don't want to know our true history, our true potential, where we came from, where we're going, and all that shit.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, the history is written by the victors. So with a nation, larger army conquers another nation, they wipe out their history, they burn the libraries, burn the books, whatever, burn their history. And to me, I feel like people like Tolkien and so many other labeled fictional authors, that's really part of our history. The thing is, how do you have proof? That's where we're had this dichotomy is it's hard to get proof other than just what you're doing. That's about the closest we can do is getting these old newspaper clippings.
It's true. It's about as close as you can get without inventing a time machine and going back to when they actually uncover some of these things that I've been making videos about and posting about that that they've uncovered. From dragons, like literal dragons with wings, to lizards like Godzilla that are 900 feet tall, which I have a few that are over 400, 500, 600, as high as 900 feet. Yeah, all the animals were gigantic. Birds, eagles, the kind of pterodactyl stories, right? The idea of which everyone's familiar with, the flying lizards kind of, but they've found skeletons of flying feathered reptiles, so to say. Feathered reptiles is quite rare. I have a few of those that are 60-foot wingspans. So we're dealing with absolutely monsters. Imagine even if you're 18 feet tall, imagine what life would be like in these time frames, right? When we're talking about, even if we're dealing with 80-foot reptiles. In my Anomalous America Alaska episode, I talk about the Duke of Westminster taking a several month-long journey to Alaska. Right, this is the mid 1800s when going from the UK to Alaska was no easy feat, right? And we're talking about a duke. This is royalty, and that was a big thing in the 1800s. Was these monarchy types were traveling the world doing big game hunting, and the kind of things they were hunting were beyond belief, so to say. no pun intended. But anyways, this article in Alaska, they're hunting a giant hairy lizard that is carrying full-size caribou in its mouth.
Dang.
And they estimate that it was, anywhere from 40 to 60 feet long and lived underground. And what's amazing about this whole thing is that, again, you have the Duke of Westminster involved, and they're hiring these hunters to come and help him kill this thing. And I've gone even farther. I've done videos about the Smithsonian was offering $5 million bounties for lizards in Africa. They called it the Dragon of the Congo. And it was $5 million in like 1919. You can do the math on how much money that would be. It's over 100 years ago, $5 million. And they're talking about all these people from around the world that are coming to get this because of this bounty. And it was not the only thing. The Smithsonian was doing bounties on all kinds of things. In fact, the dragon skeleton that I have my post on that they found in a cave in Utah that was over 100 feet long, the gentleman who owned the land and found it was offered $50,000. This is in the late 1800s, 1880s. So $50,000 in 1880. I mean, that's live your life and leave a bunch of money to your kids money.
Mm-hmm.
And he said no. And because he knew, and he, in his own words, he flat out said, the Smithsonian's going to be here in a few days, and I know that they're going to pay more. So even in this time frame, in these far out places in America, where, I mean, you're talking, it's a train ride and a horse ride just to get to town, to send a telegram, for it to get to a big city, for it to get to another city. I mean, we're talking months of journeying and, days and weeks of work just to send a message to a big city to get somebody like a representative like this out there. But they were already at this point, especially these farmers who were finding all kinds of crazy stuff, which is it's a lot of them. They knew better, and they knew to wait because the Smithsonian was paying top dollar.
It makes you wonder why they call it the Wild West. Maybe a lot of these so-called mythological creatures, they existed back then, and that's why it got called the Wild West. And then hence that's why they had these orphan trains and these trying to repopulate the West, because everybody was winding up missing and dying and stuff because of these beasts.
Yeah. Man, there's just so many examples I could give to kind of corroborate this. In my New Mexico episode of Anomalous America, I talk about an excavation they're making. And again, same story. This guy goes down 3 levels of civilization. So he's in like an adobe hut that was created by what we would call Native Americans or Indians or Aborigines. And he's digging below this. So he's uncovering a civilization that these Indians, in their own story, said, oh, they lived here, but they've been gone. They were exterminated. They were wiped out by some event. And then he goes another layer below that, and he finds this amazing kind of mausoleum. And he found what he described as a king, and he was mummified, very similar to the methods that the Egyptians employed. But he described him as being far more ancient. In fact, he said this is the most ancient example of mummification that exists in the world. Anyways, he goes on to describe a 7, nearly 8 foot tall giant man, and the people that he was living with were 4 feet tall. And they had made him the king, and in his tomb they had painted all the walls with these images of him killing saber-tooths. Like, basically the image, as the author describes it, is this man's jumping through the air wielding battle axes, killing these animals. And because he could fight and kill these animals, these people made him their king. And this is just one of several examples.
Almost like a rite of initiation or something like that.
Yeah, I think that there were events where you had these kind of, so to say, wandering tribes, or these groups of people that intermingled, right? Because when you're talking about nearly 8 foot tall giants, and they described him as red-headed, they didn't describe his skin color, but they said his hair was red, and they even could see his red hair. He was mummified so well that his hair was noticeably red. But they described the weapons, and they said that this is like Iron Age, even higher than Iron Age type technology, right? And if we're going by the what modern science and the geologists and archaeologists tell us, that as you go deeper, things get more ancient, they get less advanced, more caveman-esque, right? Because the deeper you go, you're going farther back in time. But again, as the examples I've been showing, it's quite the opposite. In fact, they go down and things get more advanced. But yeah, long way about to answer your question there. But yes, man not only befriended these giant animals and kept them as pets or companions, but they also were waging war with them. There's several of these giants that they've been found buried with dogs, or what they would call giant wolves. In fact, one of them in Nevada describes a wolf that must have been 5 to 6 feet at the shoulder, and the man that the wolf was walking with, they said that they were side by side, like a man walking with his dog. They were hunting, and they described, so this is called the Carson footprints. These are actually famous, and prisoners were digging out stone for the prison in Carson, Nevada in the 1800s, and they found these footprints in a riverbed. There's actually this has been referenced in a few books. It's pretty famous. But anyways, the size of the footprint was 18 inches, and the gate, the space between the steps, they said the man was minimum 10 feet tall. So imagine a 10-foot tall man with a 5 to 6 foot at the shoulder dog, wolf, whatever, hunting. And they said that he killed what they described as an elephant, judging by the footprints, at the water's edge, or what would have been the water's edge. And that some kind of event happened to freeze all of this in time. So you can imagine these footprints kind of in the mud, right, or in the dirt, and that some kind of event covered this and froze it in time. And you find footprints like this all around the world. But
near
what
me,
makes these
near me in Texas. Near me in Texas. I forgot the actual site, but
they're all over. My home state, Oregon, they have footprints of all kinds of stuff, especially the eastern part of my state. But yeah, so again, continuously I keep coming back to these stories of giant men fighting against giant animals, but also living side by side with them, similar to the way we do today.
Are you wanting to screen share some of your things?
We can screen share, or we can read.
Or whatever. Yeah, you can read. It'll keep the file size down, and you can send me those, and I can put them overlay. But one last question before you go into some of them.
Sure.
Do you think that some of these beasts, or whatever you want to call it, these so-called mythological creatures, you think that certain cultures around the world in ancient times could have represented these beings as gods?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have especially these hybrids, these kind of the Minotaur stories, and these centaurs, half men, half horse. Obviously the astrological, mythological overlays are quite potent when it comes to these stories. But also, what I'm hypothesizing, just again based on my own research, is that there are quite a lot of examples of these mythological beasts, these Tolkien type creatures, being real. And the skeletal records strongly suggest this as well. Again, I've hypothesized that Tolkien's Middle Earth was actually the Americas, predominantly northern Mexico and North America, southern Canada region. Because in this time period, again, when we're talking about giant humans and creatures, the weather system or the seasonal system that we have today didn't exist. The closest thing that you could use to describe it would be the term annular, the annular system, or people also use the term the vapor canopy. And in this age, men kind of lived in a perpetual light, a purple haze. There wasn't a sunset and a sunrise. There was continual light, and there was a vaporous canopy, similar to anybody that's been to a jungle, a tropical jungle, where You don't actually see the sun because the humidity envelops you. The tree canopy, as well as the humidity, kind of encapsulates you in this ecosystem. And you could think of that being this whole realm, or much more of the realm. And in part of this vaporous canopy annular system age, oxygen's levels were way higher. This has been scientifically proven. Again, I hate to use the term scientifically because you do have to tread lightly when it comes to this stuff, but they've shown through digging down, especially in a lot of these coal beds, that when they look at the fauna, the megafauna, there's obvious examples that we're dealing with. Again, going with the skeletal records, where you're dealing with gigantic animals that have relatively small airways and lungs. The only way that would even be humanly possible is with, again, much higher oxygen levels. But yeah, so this goes back to that time frame, and I think that's the only thing that I found in my studies that supports this type of thing. And you could describe the fall of this vaporous canopy as Noah's flood. Every culture has a flood myth. Every culture has a giant, not myth. I mean, a lot of these cultures, it's rock solid. Same with the flood. There was a flood before the flood. Again, if you can use the biblical terminology, right? The Nephilim, whatever. All these cultures realm wide tell the same story, that man and beast were huge, and that the world was tropical, semi-tropical, and the stars and the seasons didn't exist. And yeah, so this canopy fell in some kind of cataclysmic flood and wiped the slate clean, so to say. And like you were talking about, these kind of elites, or whatever you want to call them, I do think these things are cyclical. Again, we've talked about how many successive layers of civilization, because it's city built on city built on city. And this is everywhere in America, right? You live in Texas, I live in Oregon. I've covered this in Anomalous America, Texas, quite extensively. Texas is an amazing place.
I actually live in Louisiana. I just represent Texas.
Oh, okay. Louisiana too, though. That Louisiana has a cultural layer after layer after layer. It's the same thing. These mounds,
Poverty Point.
These mounds clearly identify this, and this is why a lot of the mounds that were excavated in the 1800s, a lot of the really amazing things that were found were concealed. And then a lot of the other mounds that weren't actually burial mounds, because as I've suggested, they were actually buried cities, and that we're dealing with the massive structures of some of these cities. Because yeah, a lot of them were actually stone buildings, huge buildings, especially in the American Southwest, Colorado. They were finding entire, what they called conical mounds that looked like just a mountain shaped like conically. Oh, that could be a volcano. When they excavated some of these, they found that they were actually giant houses that had anywhere from 100 to 1,000 rooms.
Damn.
In fact, some of these structures they found in Colorado were miles long. The largest, again, by my own study, the largest building ever discovered, ancient building, was a buried ruin they found in Colorado, and it was 6 miles long, and they estimated over 2,000 rooms. So what civilization are we dealing with that's building these type of structures? And this isn't just this small area. This is all across the realm, all across the United States. There's a good chance, if you live in a relatively major city in your home state, that there is another civilization below it. And that's pretty crazy to wrap your mind around, if not several. And that in these articles, again, going back, to the late 1700s, but, the good stuff for me is like kind of mid 1800s to late 1800s. Again, you talked about the gold rush. What was the gold rush really? Well, it was a tactic to get a large population moving west. And there was a lot of reasons to do that. It wasn't about gold. I'll tell you that much right now. And it was labor. Again, he talked about orphan trains. I've done quite a few videos on this, and I've done a few interviews over the years talking about this. In fact, I was probably one of the first people on YouTube doing specific videos on the kind of baby farm, showing what baby farms were, and that many of the kind of elite monarch type families had what were called baby farms. And in Europe, there were several. There were 5, 10, 15,000 or more, where they were getting these orphans, and nobody can really explain how, you know, a queen has a baby farm of 15,000 or 20,000 children. I mean, it's pretty unexplainable, right? There was obviously some kind of event or a war that we're not really told the whole truth about. And yeah, the orphan train subject in America is insane. And you'll find that many of the factories in the late 1700s into the early 1800s were being operated by children under the age of 15. So the main workforce in America pre-Civil War was children. And a large amount of the factory workers that went west during and after the gold rush, quote unquote, the gold rush, were children. So there's a lot of gaps to be filled in these narratives. And again, these articles kind of have been building a picture for me. And it kind of like we talked about before, that I think that these cyclical events have been known of. And that's kind of the really secret family. That's what keeps the power in the power, right? Is that they know about these events, and a lot of these quote castles and star forts and these huge kind of mega ancient cities, they have huge underground complexes. And I think that they retreat underground during these kind of dangerous time periods. And, you know, comets, earthquakes, there's a lot of speculation. But again, the newspaper articles go into quite amazing depth when it comes to describing these events, and that some of these cultures that have survived tell of these events. But yeah, I think that's kind of what has happened. And that for me, it seems likely that in between the late 1700s and the early 1800s, there was some kind of event that led to a huge amount of America being decimated. And that this gold rush, you know, they tell you that you had, again, these quote Native Americans living in the American Southwest for hundreds of years. Well, that's not true, because a lot of them say that they have, you know, 3, 4, 5 generations, and that they migrated to this area. And when they got here, it was already like this, a barren wasteland, where they had found these buildings, and they knew of these areas where obviously some kind of massive civilization had existed at one point. And I think a big part of, again, the gold rush was covering this up, digging this up, getting their hands on a lot of this stuff as quickly as they could. And, you know, the deep underground military base subject matter ties in quite extensively with this period of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, where they're finding these cave systems. And I think they were well aware of these cave systems, and that they knew that a lot of these cultures that existed all over the realm were also aware of these kind of cyclical events. I mean, all you got to do is look up. I don't think it happened in a second. I think there's a warning. Things change, the sun turns colors, whatever it is. There's many ideas of what it is. But yeah, they go underground, and then whoever gets enough people underground and comes up after these events, they have, because labor's everything, right? Again, why the orphan train, baby farm stuff is really important is because to get your civilization back on its feet, you need a lot of labor, and you don't want to wait 100 years, 200 years to grow naturally this kind of workforce you need to expand. So it seems like in the early 1800s, something happened, and there was a huge expansion, and it had a lot to do with, again, these orphans coming from Europe. And yeah, I think that there was an event that it was either a purposeful event or was a cyclical kind of atmospheric earthquake, who knows exactly, event. And it led to a kind of mad dash to regaining the lands of North America, Canada, Mexico, especially. And that the Civil War, when you really dig into the Civil War, you find a lot of holes in the story about what was really going on there. And I think it has a lot to do with again, what I'm telling you here is that the same kind of ideas that we're dealing with opposing factions that survived this event and were fighting to regain land and minerals. Resources is number one. Everything after the early 1800s is a mad dash for resources. Everything. Gold, land, labor being probably the biggest one. Because, you're going to have to think of how much water and food you need for a city of 30,000 people.
Radium.
That's not, yeah, radium. That's not a big city, 30,000. But in the early 1800s, that's really big.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about how much infrastructure is required to get a city like that, a settlement, can't even really call it a city, on its feet, it's drastic. And then you look at the expansion of America in that time frame, it is beyond the actual abilities, as we're told. We didn't have enough people, we didn't have enough infrastructure, we didn't have enough resources to build the buildings that existed in the 1800s, and the railroads, the shipping, the military. Again, the Civil War is kind of a big rabbit hole that kind of exposes a lot of the fact that we're dealing with two factions, that it wasn't just people disagreeing over, taxes and gun rights, that it was a lot more than that. It was kind of a cultural war and an extermination event. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, since we talked a lot about giant animals, I'll just read a little highlight from my Alaska beast that was hunted by the Duke of Westminster, and then I'll touch a little bit on some ancient tombs found below ground, and then we can get into the Hoover Dam.
Okay.
And talk about why I think some of these dam projects were designed to cover up these ancient civilizations, right? Because there's only so much you can do when we're talking about massive cities. I mean, how much labor can you throw at, a 100-mile square mile city? I mean, that's the kind of size we're dealing with. We're dealing with unbelievably gigantic, huge populations of people, millions.
If we need to go like 5 to 10 minutes over our allotted time, go. Yeah, no big deal.
So yeah, I think I'll just read one of this the Prehistoric Beast of Alaska article. I'm just going to summarize it, and then we'll get into Hoover Dam a little bit, talk about why I think it was to cover up some things, and I'll talk about some things that were buried and covered up, and then we can finish with the Beyond the Ice Wall stuff. That sound good to you?
Oh yeah, let's do it, man.
Okay, perfect. So for the listeners out there, I had talked about the group of big game hunters that went to Alaska to hunt this giant so-called lizard, and I'm just going to read you some excerpts from this. You can find this on my Anomalous America episode 1 Alaska video. I read the entire article, and I provide links to the excerpt in that as well. And for those who don't follow me on Twitter, I post a lot of my episodes. I have threads where I cover 20 subjects, and I give you the links to the actual articles so you can read them yourselves.
And you actually upload the clippings, the photocopy of the clippings. Yep.
I try to do as much of that as I can. Obviously, with so much material, I have only put out not even 10% of what I have actually in my archive. So again, I do videos where I don't have anything actually out in the public, but I try to provide a link to the actual hard copy if I have it. But yeah, so here we go. This is an article from 1928, and it's called Prehistoric Beast Seen. And again, I'm going to be paraphrasing. Giant saurian of the Arctic emerges, as big as 10 elephants. It passed like a hurricane across the frozen river, smashing thick blocks of ice into the air. The creature was covered in bristled hair. It had immense red eyes, and it was seen carrying a adult 700-pound caribou in its mouth as it ran up the mountainside. To kill it, explosive shells would be needed. The Duke of Westminster was certainly aware and believed in the monster. Photographs had been taken of the creature as it kicked avalanches of rocks close to their heads. A male moose let out a bellow. So this is the actual hunting party coming across. They had hired Indian guides, and they're, I think, a week into their journey, and they finally come across the creature. A male moose let out a bellow. Off they went at speed, fresh in the mud, the print of a gigantic body. The belly of the beast made a gully 4 feet deep and 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. 4 vast feet, 6 across. Horrifying above all, a pile of greenish wine-colored manure, smoking fresh, 3 cubic yards wide.
Damn.
Excrement of no possible living animal not produced by digestion of vegetable matter. Down came an avalanche of rocks, an apocalyptic sight. The prehistoric thing, it was black, bulky. It lurched down the ravine, sweeping rocks aside like pebbles. Story confirmed. Now, this is important. Story confirmed by Siberian hunters as well. So again, this is Alaska. Now, what they go on to postulate is that this animal lives underground and it hibernates for several years at a time, and that it crosses the Aleutians during the winter season. So Siberian hunters, right, all the way across the Aleutian chain, say they've been hunting this same creature and have seen it for quite a few years, and that it lives in what they call the Kursky mountain range. But yeah, so that summarizes that. They never kill the creature. It gets away, and they believe it disappears into a cave.
Kind of sounds like maybe a Bigfoot.
Yeah, but it runs on all fours. And if you go to my actual video, I show you the drawing they made of the creature. It looks like a giant lizard covered in hair.
Like a giant damn.
Like a giant lizard covered in hair. Like a typical gecko, kind of, I suppose, but with a giant caribou. The picture they took, they made a drawing of it because the light, I guess, wasn't good enough to be rendered into a print for the newspaper. But the drawing is in my link and in the actual images I share for the clipping. But yeah, that's just one of several. I have several videos on giant prehistoric beasts. There's a good one from Borneo where the French hire these big game hunters to kill this, what they call the pygmy monster. This monster that was striped like a tiger would come out of these cave systems. Again, these cave systems, these giant creatures that like kind of survived these previous ages, these events, these cataclysms, whatever you want to call them. There's always these stragglers that somehow make it into this next age. You know, these stories, again, like you talked about, nonfiction and fiction, and the blending of kind of the Jurassic Park, King Kong stories, Godzilla. These are based on, again, I think that some of these guys are reading these old newspapers, or at least they have access to these old stories.
Before you continue on that, what you're about to read, I meant to ask you or tell you earlier, man, those books, those fictional books like Tolkien, they're huge.
Mm-hmm.
Why would a brilliant author need to express his point of view, express his ideas and all that, his creativity in that thick? That's just one book, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Why? You know what I mean? Because if it's just fiction, he can shorten that up. You know what I mean? You can he's smart enough to get his point across in a better way instead of making it. When I see books that big, I think history. It needs that much detail, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yep, depth. Yeah. And you know, he taught himself Finnish, which is a difficult language, just so he could read the Kalevala, which is like their kind of mytho-poetical historical narrative, right?
He explored the world in different cultures too, I believe.
Yeah, and collected these stories and then created his own. And again, he had been quoted more than once saying that his stories were based on truth and they were not fiction. Well, yeah. Again, that's for the listeners out there. That's one of several. I have many videos on these giant creatures. Again, that pygmy monster in Borneo, they've shot at it. They actually hurt the creature. It disappeared into a cave. They called it the pygmy eater because there's these pygmies that live in Borneo. They're still there to this day. They're under 4 feet or right around 4 feet. And this monster would come out once a month or so and collect and kill these people. It would tear their village to pieces and eat these pygmies. So this story, this is again kind of big enough news, at least, again in that time frame, that the French had contacted, I believe they were English hunters, to come and kill this monster. But anyways, so that was just a taste of the kind of giant monsters. Again, I have many, many more. But I think now we're going to go into me reading a bit of the Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam construction story. The articles being written about what they were finding downstream from the dam, and that there were several groups involved in excavating these ancient cities that were due to be buried by the water, the rising water that the dam would create, right? Backstream, or whatever you would call that, upstream of the dam, where the water level, raised. I can't remember the exact amount. I believe it's 200 feet. Maybe it's more than that or less. But yeah, so we'll jump into that article. And again, I have a video on this, on that. And this article is titled Ruins of a Lost City to be Buried by Boulder Dam. Again, Boulder Dam was the name of Hoover Dam before it was renamed Hoover Dam. And I'm just going to paraphrase this article as well, as it's a huge article. So again, paraphrasing is important. But yeah, last traces of ancient race are doomed by rising waters, which will inundate the entire valley. And in this article, it shows a picture, and I'll read the caption. An 18-year-old youth studying the skeleton of a prehistoric Pueblo man buried beneath the sands of southern Nevada for untold hundreds of years. And then it shows another image of the dam and the water level behind the dam being so high that this city is basically underwater. Whence did the inhabitants of the lost city come, and where and when did they go? The answer is lost in the mists of the past. Only the skeletons of their dead and the crumbling walls of their dwellings remain. So again, if you want me to stop, I'm just going to read you the captions from the images that are provided in this full article here, and then I'll give you my opinions on it, and then I'll read you another article about a tomb they found not far from here.
Well, I had a question about I wrote down. So it seemed like it was deliberate with the creation of the Hoover Dam, to cover up something. And I'm sure Smithsonian or whoever in DC, had their filthy hands involved in it. But the flooding of the Lost City, site by the dam seems to have occurred before modern archaeological methods. Do you believe more could have been discovered about this civilization if this area wasn't fully submerged, and how much of a significance may now be permanently lost under the rising waters?
Well, it's not the first evidence of this. Again, California, and I know that this is obviously Nevada, Arizona region, but California is the most dammed place in America. And I can't remember the exact square miles, but I talk about it in my California episode. The amount of California that's been covered by dammed waters, it's unbelievable. It's a crazy amount. I mean, it's more than some states of America, right? So huge. I mean, you could fit tens of millions of people, if not more, in these areas that they've flooded. And again, if you've followed my material, I'm on, I believe, episode 20 of Anomalous America now, and every single state has the same fingerprints. Ancient cities, giants, buried relics, things that are way out of place, whether it would be hieroglyphics, burials, tombs, petrifactions, you name it. Every state has one or two or three or an endless amount of this type of fingerprints of these kind of lost races, wiped out by some kind of event or many events. And the kind of idea that we stand on the shoulders of giants is 100% undeniable for me at this point. But yes, long-winded answer. These dams, obviously, it's multidimensional. They're providing electricity, but we had ways of providing electricity that were more advanced than these dams. And when you look at the ecological,
Become a member on Patreon and support Beyond the Forbidden to watch this full-length interview. With your membership, you will have access to a vast archive of full-length, ad-free interviews, face-to-face interviews, bonus shows, and much more. So what the hell are you waiting for? The link is in the description.